Okay, so welcome to November's Integrative Conservation webinar. Today we have a very interesting presentation by Professor Jedediah Brodie from the University of Montana. But before introducing Jedediah and his presentation, I'm gonna do a bit of housekeeping about these webinars. So, and if we can have the slides about integrative conservation, please. As you know, this series of webinars happens once a month, the first Tuesday of every month, unless there's a holiday or something like that. And we normally do them at 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon, Beijing time. But today, because the speaker is in a very different time zone, we have shifted to morning time. So thank you to all of you who changed the routine to join in the morning. And this webinar series is part of Integrative Conservation, the new academic journal on biodiversity conservation published by Sisson-Banat Tropical Botanical Garden in collaboration and partnership with Wiley. As you know, this journal is published quarterly. It's open access, it's free to publish, at least until the end of 2025. And we accept a wide range of conservation-related topics, from theory to practice to policy. So then from any biome, any geographical area at any scale. So then if you are working in conservation, please read our latest issues. And if you're looking for a place to submit your papers, please consider Integrative Conservation. This morning, we just published a very interesting study by Professor James Watson and a wide range of his colleagues on priorities for the implementation of the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Global Biodiversity Framework. So, and I strongly encourage you to check our papers and look at them. So then, besides, can we have the next slide, please? We are also having special issues. So right now we have an open call for papers for manuscripts on canopy conservation as part of the conservation and management of forest biodiversity and ecosystem functions provided by forest canopies. That is, the guest editor is Professor Aki Nakamura and colleagues. So if you're working on canopy issues, please consider taking part in this special issue. And just a final reminder that we'll have the next webinar, I think it's on the 5th of December. We are planning to have a panel on wildlife conservation in China and overseas, but the lineup of speakers is not fully confirmed yet, so we will announce on due time. So then, without any further ado, let's go to today's speaker and presentation. Today's speaker is Professor Jedediah Brodie. He's a conservation ecologist who studies mammals, plants, and their interactions, combining fieldwork around the world with modeling and other techniques. And he has been working mainly in tropical Asia for the last 25 years. He was a Fulbright Research Scholar and a David Smith Conservation Fellow, and is currently a member of the ATBC, the Association for Tropical Biology Conservation Council. His work focuses on landscape connectivity for large mammals, bushmeat hunting, and climate change resilience. Jedediah works closely with governments, NGOs, local communities, and many other partners to plan, designate, and support wildlife corridors and conservation areas in Borneo and mainland Asia. Today's presentation will be a kind of a synthesis of his work in the past few years, and is titled Macroconservation, Scaling Local Actions to Global Strategies. So then, Jed, if you want to turn on your camera and start to share your slides, you can proceed with the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Ahimsa. I'm just going to share. Hold on one second. Okay. Can you guys see the talk and hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well, and we can see your slides.
All right, now let me just get rid of this Zoom ribbon and we are good to go. Okay. All right. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much, Ahimsa, for the invitation. Thank all of you for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity to give a talk to this group. I recognized a couple names in the audience, which is always fun, but I hope I can meet many more of you in person. So yes, as Ahimsa said, I'm going to be talking about kind of a synthesis of my work. And the overarching theme, as it is probably for many of us, is that we are in the midst of a global extinction crisis. This is driven by a variety of factors and is happening all over the world. And we hear about this all the time. The public hears about this all the time. But what we tend to hear is the loss of species, right? Species are going extinct. So some work I did a few years ago and highlights, this has been shown by other research as well, that it's actually more than that. It's more than just the loss of species. Every species in the world is involved in ecological interactions with other taxa around them. Many of them are affecting biogeochemical cycles. So when we lose species, we're also losing those functions. And in particular, this work that we did showed that herbivores and frugivores, so fruit-eating animals, tend to be disproportionately impacted, which means that when we lose those species, there could be cascading effects on the plants that they interact with. And we also showed that evolutionarily unique species can be disproportionately impacted in a lot of areas. So when we think about the extinction crisis, we have to think about, losing species, but also losing what we call functional diversity and evolutionary or phylogenetic diversity. So I'm going to come back to these throughout the talk as different ways of measuring diversity and different ways of accounting, of looking at human impacts. Okay, so we were looking in the same study across mammals globally and looking at all the different drivers on the IUCN red list, all the different drivers of threat and endangerment. And we found that out of all the possible things, there are really two that jump out that are driving declines in both functional richness on the top graph and phylogenetic or evolutionary diversity on the bottom graph. And those are, probably unsurprisingly, habitat loss and hunting. Now, I do want to say the next one over here, climate change, apparently has very minimal impact. I think that's a huge overstatement for a variety of reasons. And I think it's really important that we are addressing climate change. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on habitat loss and hunting and how we can address those to try to stem extinctions. All right, so starting with hunting, hunting is obviously super important for a lot of people around the world, both for providing subsistence and a variety of other cultural opportunities. But too often it can lead to loss of animals, loss of ecological function, and extinctions. So hunting can drive what we call defaunation, or the loss of fauna, the loss of animals from ecosystems. And this is happening, as I said, across the world. This has been looked at a lot in the marine literature. This is a graph showing what they call fishing down the food web, where we first fish out all the larger species, and then we eat slowly smaller and smaller organisms until we're eating jellyfish and plankton. And this kind of thing happens on land too. This is a painting of hunting in North America, in the United States, in the 1800s, when they were killing passenger pigeons, which was the most abundant bird ever to live on planet Earth. And we drove it completely extinct by overhunting them. And the hunting is driven by a huge variety of factors. There are vastly different types of hunting, of course. Economics, political and social instability. Often, I think it's really important to recognize that there are legacies of colonialism that have disrupted what were traditional and probably more or less sustainable hunting systems originally. And this overhunting has can have really important ecological impacts. So this is a study from a review article from a few years ago, where Rodolfo Durzo and colleagues argued that defaunation in the Anthropocene, the period we're living in, is both a pervasive component of the planet's ongoing mass extinction and also a major driver of global ecological change. So the loss of animals through hunting is both being caused by the extinction crisis, but is also contributing to cascading effects. So this is something that my lab has been interested in for a long time, particularly in tropical forests, where many of the hunted animals are important seed dispersers and seed predators. So the animals that are eating fruits and either destroying the seeds or moving them around and thereby helping the plant are the ones often being removed from these ecosystems. So we want to ask what happens to the rest of the ecosystem when this happens, when we remove these species. So I guess it's over a decade now, a decade ago now, we argued in a very kind of heuristic manner, we didn't have much actual data, that these defaunation effects can cascade quite far down into the ecosystem. So my colleague Holly Gibbs and I were arguing that hunting-induced defaunation can actually change the species composition of trees and lianas. And that's because the trees and lianas in tropical forests, as I said, they're all interacting with different animals through seed predation or seed dispersal, herbivory as well. And so when you take out those animals, you alter the population trajectories of trees in different ways. And it turns out that through some life history trade-offs that I won't get into, the trees with the really high density wood tend to be the ones that are lost most often. So hunting changes the composition of the forest in ways that reduces the overall wood density of the trees. And therefore, that reduces forest carbon storage. So it's this interesting hypothesis where just hunting animals on the ground can actually potentially affect like global carbon cycling, right? And global climate mitigation, therefore. So just to be clear, it's not that the trees go away. You can still walk out in a heavily hunted forest and there are beautiful trees around, but it's that many of them are not recruiting. And so which trees are around you is slowly changing. And the trees that are doing well and are replacing the other ones are lighter density and therefore store less carbon. So this has been looked at in a variety of ways. Obviously, it's a difficult thing to get experimental traction with. But so one of my favorite studies was by Carlos Perez and colleagues from the Amazon, where they used simulations parameterized by field data to look at how defaunation would affect carbon storage across the whole of the Amazon basin. And so the red colors are losses of carbon, in some cases really high. So they're predicting huge potential impacts of defaunation on carbon storage in this vast tropical forest. But so this is an incredible first step. But especially at the time, and even today, actual evidence for how defaunation affects tree demography is still limited. So this is what I've had a series of students focusing on, and we use experimental defaunation. So this is my very first PhD student, Alice Granados, and she built different types of exclosures in Danam Valley in Malaysia to exclude big herbivores like elephants, and then smaller things like deer and pigs, and then smaller things still like a variety of rodents. So it's a partly factorial exclusion. And then she crossed that statistically with habitat disturbance, in that we had these experiments in both logged and unlogged forest. And, to sum up a huge amount of work, one of the main take-homes was that experimentally losing mammals does affect seedling recruitment and mean wood density even of the seedlings, but only in logged forest. And this is still really important because most tropical forests, of course, are logged and otherwise disturbed. So this is an impact that could be spatially very, very widespread. But we still need a lot more work to track these seedling impacts through the full life cycle of the plants to the forest. So then I had another student, Peter Williams, building on this with a different series of experiments that were nested. So he had these exclosures, the same ones that Alice was using, but then within that, he would also exclude insects using insecticide and fungi using fungicide. And he found some really interesting things. So this is a graph of just how many seeds are destroyed by different consumers. So when everything has access to the seeds, so big mammals, small mammals, insects, and fungi, around 60 or 70% of seeds are killed, and around 25% are killed by vertebrates. Now, when you exclude the large animals, the pigs and deer and whatnot, obviously the amount of vertebrate mortality goes down a lot. The total amount of mortality is unchanged. And then when you exclude all mammals, the amount of the proportion of seeds that are killed by vertebrates goes to zero, as we'd hope. That just means that our exclosures or experimental treatments were working. But the proportion of seeds across the board that were killed is statistically unchanged. And this is, I think, really interesting because it's showing that, like all of ecology, it's really complicated. So it's not just a matter of taking out the mammals and looking at what happens. In this case, when you take out the mammals, the insects and fungi completely compensate. So the mammals go away, but this ecological process of seed predation stays the same. So these are the kind of ecological complexities that we need to be building into our more complete understanding of these processes. Okay, so just briefly, some next steps where I want to take this. In Borneo, the bearded pig is the dominant herbivore and granivore, and they were causing most of that large mammal-induced seed mortality. But they have suddenly and more or less completely disappeared from our ecosystem through an introduced disease, the African swine fever, which has been sweeping the world. So this is just a graph of detections of pigs over the last, 8 years or so. You can see a spike right here during COVID when pigs and all sorts of other animals were really abundant. But then right after that, African swine fever hit and pigs completely disappeared. So just gone. So what we want to do is now redo these experiments and try to see, without this animal, how has the community changed? And I want to tie that into as well a whole bunch of other data streams. So one of the big project strategies I'm trying to focus on right now is whole system automated monitoring. And I mention this because if anyone in the audience is doing this or interested in doing this as well at different sites, please let me know. I'd love to develop a network of plots where we do this. So, for example, there's a series of plots around the world where we have long-term data on tree and liana demography, things like forest geo and whatnot. We can combine that with camera trap data to look at the terrestrial vertebrates, and acoustic sensors to look at birds, bats, katydids, cicadas, ultrasonic recorders. Well, that's for the bats. Drones and satellites. I have a student right now, Adi Shibrani, who's in Malaysian Borneo, using drones to try to map the phenology of the forest to the fruiting patterns. And then automated detectors, if we can, for insects and fungi and everything else. Feed all that together into the advanced Bayesian or AI ecological network models that are getting more and more sophisticated every month, and try to finally understand how these super complicated ecosystems are working. Okay, so that was a little side pitch. I want to return now and look at what do we actually do about overhunting. Obviously, there are a huge variety of strategies we can take and we should be taking. One of the first steps, I argue, is that we need to know where the problem is. And so it's really important to map any kind of threat to biodiversity. And for most threats to biodiversity, we can very well. Climate change, forest loss, overfishing, air pollution. We can map these, right? There are really good high-resolution maps of where these are occurring. But for hunting, that hasn't traditionally been the case, particularly in the tropics, because it's really hard to just figure out where people are going to do the hunting. So another student, former student of mine, Maren Deeth, worked on this in Malaysian Borneo, where she used what's called electrical circuit theory to predict. This is often used to map the movements of non-human animals in the forest. She's using it to predict the movements of the human hunters themselves. So starting with a map of the settlements, and then the roads and navigable rivers. So humans will then start at the settlements, work their way out into the landscape on the roads and rivers. From there, set off into the forest on foot, where their movement speed is affected by topography, and then end up with a map of accessibility, really, which is correlated with, which is a proxy for potential hunting pressure. So then she can validate this with our camera trap data, because the camera traps, of course, are designed to detect non-human animals, but they also detect plenty of human hunters. So we can validate the predictions of where hunters are going to be with the actual photos of hunters, and they work. The correlation was very strong, so this worked out really well. All right, so this is a first step, and then she extrapolated this from this part of Malaysian Borneo out to all of Southeast Asia. So now showing Borneo, Sumatra, this is mainland Asia here. And you can see some interesting patterns, right? Just that in general, hunting pressure is much higher. The red colors are much higher in mainland Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, than in Borneo. Sumatra's a bit in between. You can actually see the road networks tracing out into the landscape. I'm going to come back and use this map a little bit more later in the talk. But for now, I want to shift gears. I am going to come back and talk about hunting a bit more, but I'm going to shift gears right now and talk about habitat. So the other huge extinction driver. And in this context, I want to talk about two things: protected areas and connectivity among the protected areas. So for this part of the talk, I'll be focusing on a lot of the field work I've done in Borneo. So here, it's just right here, third largest island in the world. It straddles the equator. And this is what the forests, the intact forests of Borneo look like. They're just spectacular. Some of the tallest angiosperm forests in the world. I've been really privileged to get to do this work all over the place in a huge variety of settings, with a number of indigenous communities, which has been really incredible. And also with my family, staying, as you can see, in not very luxuriant conditions a lot of times. And of course, setting out these cameras, we just end up with tens or hundreds of thousands of photos that look like this, that are the animals of the ecosystem. So this is the bearded pig here, which I've talked about. This is an orangutan, of course. This is the Sunda clouded leopard, which is the apex predator of Borneo. So we use these data to try to address important global strategies like this one, which is the UN 30 by 30 goal. Okay, so this came about very recently. This was the Kunming Montreal conference, which completed in December of this last year. So it's very recent. And in it, the nations of the world committed to protect 30% of their land and sea areas through well-connected systems of protected areas by 2030. So hence the 30 by 30. And so there are two, I've underlined and bolded these, but I think there are two really important parts of this. One is just the aerial target, 30%. And the other is that these protected areas need to be well-connected. So I'm going to talk about both of these, starting with the connectivity. And this is work that I've been doing in Sarawak, Malaysia, for over a decade now. And so the island of Borneo, very recently, really, as of 1950, had almost as much forest cover as it did 5,000 years ago. In the intervening time, it's declined by probably a little over half, which is actually still pretty good for tropical Asian areas. A lot of that decline in forest cover has been through the expansion of this super lucrative agricultural crop, oil palm, which I'm sure everyone in the audience knows all about. So I was working with colleagues, whom I'll talk about in just a second, and the state of Sarawak to develop a statewide connectivity plan. So the idea, this is the island of Borneo. This is the state of Sarawak here in the north. Borneo actually has a pretty good system of protected areas already, shown here as the green blobs. But the problem is that almost all of those are not big enough on their own to support populations of big, low density, wide ranging species like clouded leopards or orangutans or other things. So the solution, of course, is to not let them become on their own, but rather to either keep connections among them or reestablish connections among them via habitat corridors, so that the animals and plants can move amongst the protected areas to complete their life cycles and whatnot. But all right, so you look at a map though like this and say, well, that's a lot of potential corridors. We're never going to have enough political will or financial ability to protect all of those potential corridors. So our objective then was to prioritize them and determine which of those were the most important ones, and then focus our conservation efforts there. So the way we did this is we had a series of analytical steps. The first was to link the field data that I already talked about, namely the camera trapping data, with remote sensing data. And this is something probably many of the people in the audience do, right? We use the field data as our response variables, the remote sensing as our predictor habitat variables, and we can determine habitat selection for any number of species. Then we apply movement models. And these are the same circuit theory-based models that I mentioned earlier that my student Maren Deeth had been using to map human hunter movement. And so now we're predicting the path. So as an animal in this one protected area, so this gray blob is a protected area, as an animal wants from here, needs to get to this other protected area, what's the route it's going to follow? And what are its chances of making it successfully there? Okay, so that's how we get at landscape connectivity. But then there's one more step, and I think this is really key. I think a lot of people, there's a kind of trend to just look at connectivity in its own right. But to me, connectivity is not the end goal. Connectivity is a means to an end. The end goal is just to reduce extinction, to have these animals not go extinct. So we put the connectivity into metapopulation models to then look at how do different corridors affect the long-term persistence of all the species in the system. And obviously, I'm not going to talk about the details of these models, but I'm happy to later, or it's in some of our publications. So then we can say the importance of any given corridor is the contribution of that corridor to the long-term persistence of all the species. And now this is a portion of Sarawak again. Now the black blobs are the protected areas, and the colored links are the potential corridors among them. And so this histogram is now showing the importance values of all the corridors, or at least the top 10. And you can see a really interesting pattern, which is that the importance value changes a huge amount across corridors. And note that the corridor importance here is log transformed. So these two corridors, these red ones here and here, are literally orders of magnitude more important than every other possible corridor on the whole island of Borneo. And then these next three in pink, here, here, and here, are themselves substantially more important than every other corridor on Borneo. So this is really good because it says, well, we don't need to try to conserve all the possible corridors. We only need to focus on, at the very least these two, but ideally maybe these 5. So you might be asking, well, okay, what is it about those corridors that makes them so important? It's really 2 things. So this is the importance of corridors on the y-axis as a function of the length of the corridor on the x-axis, showing that as corridors get longer, they get less important. And then the other thing is that the size of the patches they're connecting becomes important. So if the corridor is connected to a big patch, or ideally 2 big patches, then it's much more important than if it's connected to small patches. So the take home here is that, just as kind of a rule of thumb, if you don't have the ability if you don't have the data or time or resources to go do an analysis like this anywhere else, just a rule of thumb, we think, is that short links are the ones you should focus on, particularly if they connect large habitat patches. All right, so now in parallel with the whole research effort, I've been working with a couple of friends and a variety of other stakeholders to try to translate the eventual results of our research into conservation. So none of this would have been remotely possible for an outsider like me without being able to collaborate with my friends Aslan Mohammed, who's a professor at the University of Malaysia, Sarawak, and Jason Hahn, who currently runs the Sarawak program for WWF. And through working with them, they've been able to assemble, teams and groups, and of course, through the action of the government and in some cases private industry, we are slowly chipping away at getting protection for those top 5 corridors, where we've got probably 3 reasonably well protected, or hopefully will be very soon, and working on the others. All right, now back to the 30 by 30 goal. So that was the connections, the well-connected bit of the 30 by 30 goal. But the other part of the 30 by 30 goal, of course, is the protected areas themselves. That was arguably the key part of the Kunming Montreal conference outcomes. So, after that, again, last December, the New York Times says nearly every country signs on to a sweeping deal to protect nature. I will say that one of the few that didn't was the United States, which is a separate issue that we can potentially get into later. But in the meantime, there's this very important question, which is, will this actually work? Are protected areas actually effective at conserving biodiversity? And there are reasons to think that they may or may not be. And this is a project I've been working on with a bunch of people. I want to highlight again my friend Mohammed Aslan at UNIMAS, also Cheng Chen, who's done a lot of work in XTBG and surrounding environments. And then I had a great experience working with the JEDI ecosystem LIDAR team at Northern Arizona University. Okay, so the question then is, how well do protected areas work? Worldwide, most parks are underfunded and have poor management and enforcement. So this is a picture of the inside of a national park in Sumatra, showing just complete deforestation inside this protected area. But then even if that doesn't happen, even if the forest structure remains intact, you often have defaunation, right? Even parks that succeed at protecting forest cover can still suffer defaunation. Okay, so then we have to also ask, what about protected area impacts on biodiversity outside the actual boundaries of the reserve? And so say we've got a protected area here that manages to keep this forest intact, but then the logging companies, instead of logging in the protected area, they just go outside and log just as much as they would have done anyway. So we would call that leakage, and that's been documented all over the world. But then on the other hand, you could have the opposite effect, which we call spillover. And this has been particularly well documented in marine protected areas, where you set up a no-take zone, an area where people are not allowed to fish. And then the populations of fish and squid and everything else build up inside there. And then they spill out into the surrounding unprotected areas where people can harvest them, of course, but then also they're increasing the abundance and diversity of those areas. So the question that I think remain to be answered, particularly for tropical terrestrial systems, is whether leakage or spillover is the dominant pattern. All right, so as you might imagine, these are super important conservation questions. So there have been many studies on them. This is one of my favorites by, by Jonas Geldman and colleagues, where they looked at the efficacy of protected areas across the world. And they found a pretty marked effect. Now, you don't need to know all the different categories here, but basically these are all different types of protected areas in the green oval here, compared to unprotected areas here in the red. And the change in human pressure is much, much higher in the unprotected areas than in the protected areas. So this is super important initial work. The problem is that there's all over the world, there's a bias in where protected areas are located, which makes it really difficult to assess their efficacy. So this is a quote from a paper by Joppa and Pfaff, which I really like, that protected area networks are biased towards places that are unlikely to face land conversion and also hunting pressures, even in the absence of protection. So, you know, like a lot of the parks in North America are put way up in high elevation areas that are really out of the way, where we couldn't have grown agriculture anyway. So even if we hadn't made it into a national park, it might still not have contributed much to actual conservation. So there's this bias in where protected areas are located needs to be accounted for. And what we would say statistically is that the efficacy of the protection status itself is confounded with these two things, forest quality and accessibility. So we can get around this by statistically deconfounding, as long as we have really good data on forest quality and accessibility. So the forest quality data comes again from this Jedediah data set. Jedediah is a global LiDAR platform attached to the International Space Station, which has just been an incredible data source. So this is a map of Borneo. This is not even hot off the press. This hasn't even been published yet. You won't have seen this yet. But this is a high resolution map of the three-dimensional forest structure in Borneo, where PAI is the plant area index, going from 0 to 6. And 6 means there are 6 layers of leaves between the ground and the sky. And so if you're to zoom in on any pixel here in the landscape, you could actually see the three-dimensional structure of the forest showing up. So this provides us with an incredible way of measuring habitat quality for the animals that are using the forest. And this is how so then including this information is how we deconfound the forest quality. And then for deconfounding accessibility, we're just going to use that same extrapolated accessibility map that my former student Marin had created. So this is accessibility of mainland Southeast Asia, Sumatra, and Borneo, going from low in yellow to high in red. So we've got this map. We've also got the equivalent Jedediah map, the forest structure. We overlay over that camera trap sites. So we have 1,600 camera trap sites from across the region. We also looked at birds using community science data from eBird, so around 1,000 eBird sites. And then protected areas. So we've got a whole network of protected areas in all the different countries. All right, so these are where all the data come from, and now I'll actually show you our results. So this is from the paper that just came out in October, in August, a couple months ago. So this is the effects of protected areas on bird diversity, and again we've got our different metrics of bird diversity. You've got species richness, functional richness, and phylogenetic or evolutionary diversity. And for all of these facets, being in a protected area means that the diversity is higher than being outside a protected area. So this is important because, yes, we know that protected areas tend to just be less accessible, and they tend to just have better forest anyway. But even aside from that, even statistically accounting for that, we can show that protected areas, something about the protection status itself, helps conserve all facets of bird diversity. Now, for mammals, the story was a little bit different. And for mammals, the main effects that we detected were outside the reserves. And so here, again, we've got our 3 different facets of diversity: species richness, functional richness, phylogenetic diversity. And what we found was that the diversity was higher outside of parks, but near large parks than near small parks. So this is, it's hard to necessarily say that this is causal, but it's at least statistically consistent with spillover rather than leakage being the dominant pattern. So I think this is really useful for the 30 by 30 goals because it really justifies them. It says that, yes, if we increase protected area coverage substantially, then we should be able to increase diversity of at least these 2 taxa. Okay, I want to make 2 small tangents before I return to the main story. One is that I think these data also have implications for what are called essential biodiversity variables. So the international conservation community has been coming up with ways to monitor biodiversity across space and through time in robust ways. And they call these essential biodiversity variables. And for species, at least, the essential biodiversity variables are species distributions. And so the idea is you take your occurrence data, say something like camera trap data that I've talked about, your environmental data, say your remote sensing and other types of data, your species attributes like the functional traits that I haven't talked about explicitly, but are implicit in some of the approaches I've used. And then you combine all those to get occurrence predictions for a whole range of species. That's all well and good. The problem, though, is that it risks ignoring empty forests that are structurally intact. So where the trees are there, but the animals have been hunted out. So in other words, if you're just trying to map occurrence data as a function of, say, forest cover or even forest structure from Jedi, you don't know if the forest looks good from space, but doesn't actually have any animals in it because they've all been hunted out. So I propose a slight modification to this, which is where we separate the non-human species occurrence from actual human occurrence data. And the first step in the analysis is to combine the human occurrence with the environmental data to get a map of accessibility or potential hunting, as I've talked about. That then serves as a predictor variable along with environmental data to generate your actual occurrence predictions. So it's not a complicated change, but it makes it a two-step process. And I think it probably, especially for any species that's heavily affected by hunting, I think this will probably generate much less biased occurrence predictions. All right, and then the second small tangent I want to talk about is putting these things together, putting hunting and protected areas together, and thinking about using no-take zones in terrestrial systems. So I talked about them in marine systems, but applying them to terrestrial forests to increase bushmeat harvest and also to increase the persistence of the species being harvested. So this is work that, again, my former student Maren Deeth had been working on, where she used a variety of simulations parameterized with as much field data as we could get, which is not a ton, to assess how different rotational strategies for no-take zones would affect hunter offtake rates and also the persistence of the hunted species. So what we mean by rotational strategies are, you could set up a no-take zone, say this hillside right here. You say, okay, no hunting allowed there. And then as animals spill out into this adjacent area, you can harvest them there. Or you could rotate the no-take zone. So this hillside's a no-take zone for a year, 5 years, 10 years, and then it's not. And the no-take zone moves over here, and you can go in and harvest all the animals that have accumulated here. So we wanted to explore how these different strategies would affect the two things we were trying to optimize, which were the persistence of the animals, we don't want them to go extinct, and the offtake rates for the hunters. We want them to be able to generate an income, feed their families, et cetera. So based on these simulations, this is looking at now the percent increase in hunter offtake compared to not having any no-take zones at all. And a couple of patterns emerge here. One is as you go from one reserve, one no-take zone, up to 2, up to 3, you get a slight increase in offtake rates, which is good. As you go from a 1-year rotational strategy to a 5-year, and especially to a 10-year rotational strategy, those offtake rates get higher and higher. Now we're looking upwards of a 50% increase in hunter offtake rates over what we would have had. But then if you don't rotate them at all, if you just keep them where they are, then the benefits are even higher. You get over 100% increase in how much meat you're able to sustainably take out of the system. So this is very preliminary, and I would not prescribe any management based on this. This is kind of a proof of concept that we're hoping to explore now with additional data. All right, so back to the last part of my talk, where I want to talk about taking a lot of what we've learned about protected areas and connectivity and actually using them to designate new tropical protected areas. This was, again, a big, really fun, highly collaborative project with partners in the UK and the US and mostly in Malaysia. The analyses I'll talk about in a minute were largely led by my former postdoc, Sarah Williams, who did just an incredible job. So the problem statement is that the state of Sabah in Malaysia, prior to the study, had around 25% protected area coverage. So around 25% of the state was already protected. The Sabahans of their own accord wanted to increase this to 30%. This was before 30 by 30 really came on the scene. So this is super proactive and impressive of the state of Sabah. What that entailed was they needed around 380,000 additional hectares of conservation area, which is around 4.8 Singapore. So it's a fairly big chunk of area. And in some ways, most interesting of all is they didn't just say, here's where we want the protected areas to be. They contracted this large team of scientists to help them figure that out, help them crunch numbers and figure out where are the best places from a biodiversity perspective for these new protected areas to go. And I do want to say too that this the domain in which we could possibly consider for new protected areas was the state forest estate already. So it was forest lands owned by the state anyway, which really didn't have local communities living inside them. So we didn't have to deal with that super important and very complicated issue of local community attitudes. Although, just to be safe, we did work with a local Sabahan NGO that did a bunch of free, prior, and informed consent interviews with communities in the areas just to gauge attitudes and try to reduce or mitigate any impacts that way. Okay, so the typical approach here would have been to use something like MarkSan, which is an incredibly powerful program. And just from their own website, it says that MarkSan is the most widely used decision support software for conservation planning globally, used in 184 countries. That's fairly old. It's probably more by now. And that's like most of the countries on Earth. So this is an incredibly useful tool. The problem is, at least then, it didn't account for area. It only accounted for area. It didn't directly account for connectivity, which, as I've been talking about, is really important. So we developed a hybrid approach that used optimization algorithms like MarkSan, but where we also tried to include connectivity. And so this is Sabah, the state of Sabah again, showing where the red are the currently protected areas. And then these purple blotches, that's the zones of connectivity where we ran these movement models and where we predicted that would be the most important for animals to use as they got from one park to another. All right, so then we put all these different conservation features that we cared about into the optimization algorithm. So we had data on plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, mainly this was just butterfly, not just butterflies, but mainly butterflies were the only taxon we had invertebrate data for. Above ground carbon, because to help Malaysia fulfill its national and international mitigation targets. And then, of course, connectivity, which we measured in two ways. One was through actual corridors among parks, as I've been talking about. And the other was elevational connectivity, so connecting lowlands to highland areas so that animals and plants can move up in elevation as they need to respond to climate change. Okay, so we throw that into the optimization. We get our final prioritized area. It's a little bit bigger than we were shooting for, but this gives the policymakers some leeway to have a little bit of subjective choice in there as well. So given these top three layers and then the bottommost layer, that's all very typical for a MarkSan type analysis. It's this connectivity bit that was novel. And so given that it was novel, we wanted to ask whether there were any downsides to including that, whether there are any costs to, if we try to conserve connectivity, does that mean that we're less able to conserve these other features that we care about? This is what we found. So this is how much of each conservation feature we're able to protect, both without connectivity and with connectivity. And now, hopefully, you're kind of squinting at that, saying, well, I don't really see too much difference there. And indeed, there is not much difference. For three of the conservation features, there's no difference at all. And for butterflies and forest carbon, we're able to conserve a tiny bit less, tiny bit less of the feature than we would without connectivity. Okay, so then this is back to our map of Sabah, the orange bit, sorry, the kind of yellow bits are the existing protected areas. The orange are the proposed new protected areas. And you can see it's not one big new park, and it's not 1,000 tiny ones. It's a manageable number of new conservation areas, all of which are really important for biodiversity in their own right. They have really high, preserving tons of species in each area, but then they're also enhancing connectivity. And I particularly want to highlight this one here. This is in southwestern Sabah, in what's called the Ulu Padas region, where I've done a bit of work in collaboration with the local community of Long Pasir, and specifically my friend Pangeran Salutan, who is just an incredible naturalist and incredibly enthusiastic about hunting sustainability and biodiversity for his cultural livelihood. So this is just an incredible area to work. Lots of wildlife, including, non-human primates, super cute human primates running around. That's my son many years ago. Giant trees, it's a really special place. And if anyone wants to go check that out for ecotourism, obviously, please let me know. I'm happy to give you some recommendations. But on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. I have, of course, a ton of people to thank who I won't list all by name, but I've been so privileged to work with so many incredible collaborators over the years. Special shout out to my family. Again, I do a lot of this work with my wife, Olga, and my kids, Joaquin and Nico. I've had so many wonderful students and postdocs over the years. That's just been a pleasure. And once again, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. It has been a really, really good presentation, very interesting. And I'm very pleased to see, I have been in Ulu Padas not a long time ago. One of the best forests I've been in my life. And
Nice.
I remember the feeling of, the amount of water and the size of the trees and the lack of people was something very impressive to enjoy. So then, just for the audience, we will move to some questions now. I will do 2-3 questions to Jeff, and then we will open for questions to the floor. If you want to make a question and you're in Zoom, you can raise your hand or just mention on the chat box. If you're on Coursera or in Shouton, just type your question in the box, and then we will tell the questions to Jeff. Yeah, just to let you know, we had around 1,500 people following the presentation. Wow. So I think has been a very, very successful presentation. So I have many questions. One of them is about hunting. So then hunting has been a huge force in ecosystems, as you have been showing. But also, I expect it to be a very dynamic behavior, affected by socioeconomic patterns and cultural changes and even demographic changes. So then, what is your expectation, maybe focusing on Southeast Asia, for the change in hunting pressure, let's say in one human generation time, in 30 years from now? Do you think will be similar to what we saw? You will see more hunting, less hunting, or some special change?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think, so I kept talking about hunting as if it was all the same, but obviously hunting has very, very different things within it, right? And so I think so I didn't talk about hunting for super high value species like tigers and pangolins. I unfortunately don't really see that decreasing. In fact, I probably see that increasing until those species are gone, frankly. But the hunting I was talking about was more subsistence hunting. And honestly, in a lot of areas, I think that's going down in Asia because of just demographic trends and the young people moving out of the longhouses, out of the villages to the cities. So I'm kind of almost expecting, we in the conservation world, they talk about the forest transition, right? where at a certain point, the socioeconomics of a country are such that it stops losing forest and starts gaining forest. I kind of think that same pattern would be expected for wildlife, where we see a wildlife transition, at least for the subsistence hunting species, again, not for the tigers and pangolins.
Yeah, that's a very nice term, wildlife transition. I was going to ask you something very similar, which is reformation. So I think our generation has been living and working on defaunation as one of the key issues in tropical rainforest and tropical forest. But also we begin to see some local kind of reversion of the process in which conservation begins to be effective, and then we see clear increases in populations, and there has been this movement with the wild and all these things. So then how do you see this happening in Southeast Asia?
With the refaunation?
Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, I think it'll be really fascinating to see how the ecology of that plays out. And we don't have any data on that yet. I mean, we've got the experiments, right, where we have the animals or not, but it's not super satisfying when we're talking about like more continuous changes in abundance of different species. I don't know. That's a great question. We should explore that some more.
Yeah. I think it's one of the hot areas of ecology and conservation, including both the defaunation and the refaunation in the picture. You ask whether people are working on ecosystem monitoring and large scale study. XTBG, our institution, is doing a huge amount of work. Not only in China, we have a network of plots. It's called the 101. It goes around the longitude 101 from the Himalayas all the way down to Paso. And it's integrating a lot of technology, and they are very exciting plans. So I think it's something we can follow up on. I can introduce some colleagues from here from XTBG.
Super excited about that.
And something I really like about your work is how you connect from remote sensing and large scale science planning, but also the on the ground kind of fine scale planning implementation. And we know that there are some very good plans for corridors. In particular, Southeast Asia has some very good examples, and I will think about the Central Forest Spine in Peninsula Malaysia, and it's very, very exciting to see what's happening in Sarawak. So how do you see the implementation? So I guess the science is probably the easy part, and the planning is also kind of easy, but how is it working on the ground in terms of protecting corridors, and how are they being protected? And also, are you doing any work on evaluating effectiveness once that these corridors are established?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think you're right to point out the Central Forest Spine in Peninsula Malaysia, also the Heart of Borneo, which is a trinational agreement in Borneo that's aimed to do the same thing. I think about those two things a lot, and they provide quite different examples. I think the Central Forest Spine, a lot of what they want for linkages have already been severed. And so they're in the position of having to recreate linkages. And they're doing that in some cases really remarkably well. I mean, they've got a lot of money and they're building wildlife overpasses, right? Putting huge highways up on bridges so that animals can move along underneath. And then probably the most important part of it is the hunting, controlling the hunting, right? And I didn't really talk about that much, but hunting, of course, it's perfect. It's fine. It's one thing to designate a corridor, but if the hunting is too high, that animals are not going to use it. And in fact, it could even be an ecological sink. It could be bad for the animals, right? So I know there are a ton there's a lot of good anti-poaching work going on in Peninsula Malaysia. I think with the Heart of Borneo, they're catching it at a little bit earlier stage. So the connections haven't been as severed, so it's much easier to do the connectivity there. But then, so I guess just for the region in general, aside from Borneo, most of the rest of the region has been pretty fragmented and deforested. So they'll be in more the CFS boat. But the other really important piece of the puzzle is restoration, right? And that's, I think, something that in a lot of connectivity planning, people just look at where is the existing forest. Let's find a corridor of existing forest. But it might very well be that so the best place to put a corridor doesn't currently have forest, but if we could replant and establish a nice forest there, it'd be perfect. Same thing with protected areas. So I think there's some really important needs for synergy between protected area planning, connectivity planning, and ecological restoration. And of course, hunting, some working with hunting.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, so then let's open for questions. If you're in Zoom and you want to make the question yourself, please raise your hand and I will invite you to make the question. And then we have, please, Dosa, when you make a question, please introduce yourself, say who you are and your institution, and then just formulate your question. Thank you.
Well, maybe before I go to my question, because I have several ones, the speaker can start with the one in the chat box first, because we have like 3 or 4 in the chat box. Are you able to see the question?
I will read them. I will read them. You can just ask to Jet.
So yeah, you can read that and he will answer those first so that later I can have my question.
You can make your question first, and I will take a look at it later.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Really wonderful talk, and I really enjoy listening to how you connect from the local to global, and also how you actually engage with the local people and the stakeholders. So I have 3 questions or 4. Let's start. The first one is about when you were talking about hunting, you mentioned about the legacy of colonialism, and I'm not sure how do you make the connection or what are the implications for that. That's the first question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm definitely not an expert in this. A close friend of mine, Graydon Froese, has been doing a lot of interesting work on this in Gabon. And I think the issue, you think about local communities, in Borneo, for example, that had hunting management systems. They had, self-regulation. They had taboos and they had controls on who would hunt or when or how often or which species at which times of year, et cetera. And obviously those weren't perfect. I mean, humans have driven things extinct all over the world for 10,000 years, but they were probably in many cases very good. But the colonialism just was such a huge disruptor of social structure everywhere, in traditional villages up to, whole region, kingdoms, sultanates, that some of those endogenous hunting regulations and management techniques were lost or otherwise just disrupted and not able to be used anymore. Or, and then combined with the colonists themselves often coming in and just doing a ton of unsustainable hunting themselves, or in combination with destroying the habitat, which obviously affects then the abundance of species. So yeah, it's definitely not something I'm an expert at, but I think it's something that's really important to consider.
And thank you. The next one is about the low or less recruitment due to hunting you mentioned. So yeah, it seems like you have touched some of the mechanism, but it wasn't that clear to me. And also, actually, it comes to that graph where you remove some animals and see how, and you mentioned about the compensation. So first of all, what is the mechanism behind the less recruitment? And then the subsequent question is, when you have compensation, how do you communicate that to local people or stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for the first question, the mechanisms were the plant-animal interactions, either seed dispersal or seed predation. So a lot of the work I was doing initially was with seed dispersal. And so the idea is these trees have evolved fleshy fruits in order to attract animals to eat them and move the seeds away. And if the seeds get dispersed, then they have a better chance of germinating and growing up into adult trees. So with too much hunting, the seed dispersal gets reduced, right? The seed dispersing animals are taken away. So the seeds rather than being dispersed throughout the forest, tend to just fall under the parent tree, and their germination rates are much, much lower. So that's the main mechanism by which hunting can affect animal dispersed trees. The predation bit gets, is maybe slightly more complicated because the animals are destroying the plant seeds, right? So when you take them away, you're helping certain plants. Of course, then you're altering the competition among different tree species. So, everything changes. But your question about communicating that to policymakers or stakeholders, I haven't even tried to do that yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to communicate it to other scientists and how to think about it myself in terms of what does this even mean for species interactions, right? We're so used to measuring species interactions by things like these removal experiments. But if, we know pigs have a huge effect on dipterocarp trees because they eat all their seeds. But if you take them away, it doesn't change seed mortality at all because the insects and fungi just step in. So I'm honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how to even then think about that just scientifically.
And then the last one is about the spillover for large animal you mentioned. So any reason behind it when it comes to protected areas?
Oh, so why they're not, why the
outside of the protected areas you have more diversity.
Right. So the spillover, yeah. So there are a couple of different possibilities there for why the spillover effects could be happening. One possibility is that it's an actual ecological effect, such that, just like with marine protected areas, if you've got a good terrestrial park, then the populations of larger animals will build up and then spill out into the surrounding landscape. And that will happen more in a big park because the big park will be able to support a higher total abundance. Alternatively, or potentially in addition, there could also be effectively a spillover of human activities. So if there's conservation and outreach in the park, if there's a lot of investment in conservation in the park, that could potentially spill over into surrounding areas as well, where the villages surrounding the protected areas are exposed to that, the enforcement and the, more beneficial, interactive management activities, and just, and so those human management activities are what's spilling out. And we don't know, we have no idea if it's one or the other or both or something entirely different.
Yes, thank you so much for your answers.
Thank you, Dosa. We have several questions on the chat group, the chat box. So Thousand Fish is asking, does the log forest have less vertebrate species diversity than the old growth forest? And then will hunting intensity be higher or lower in the log forest in Borneo? And these are areas of indigenous people, but it means that higher hunting risk for mammals. How do you deal with that conflict between indigenous people's, I guess, traditional costume and access to protein and protecting the ecosystem?
Yeah. These are great questions. So in general, in Borneo, logged forests have lower diversity and abundance of animals. But that's because they tend to be, in general, more heavily hunted. Where you do have logged forests that is not hunted, my data suggests that the abundance and diversity of mammals is about the same as in an unlogged forest. So yes, logging has an effect on mammals, but mainly via enhancing hunting. The question, so Ahimsa, did I get the third question right? That what's the balance between protecting?
Yeah, how to manage the conflict?
Yeah.
Conservation and people's.
That's a key. That's the key question here, and I actually think it's. I think it's traditionally been viewed as a conflict between conservation and local human livelihood. But I don't view it that way. I think that if we manage hunting sustainably, and by we, I mean just humans, if hunting is managed sustainably, it's a win-win for everybody. It's good for the wildlife, it's good for the forest ecosystems that depend on the hunted animals, and it's good for the local people because they have a larger supply of things to hunt for the long term. So I see this as like a multi-objective optimization where we're all kind of going for the same thing. We're going for more animals and sustainable hunting. And I think, at least in most of the places I've worked, the best way to do that is through the local communities themselves, either maintaining or reestablishing ground up controls over hunting. I think it doesn't really work to have the state impose these restrictions. What I'm super excited about is the collaboration between local communities with their absolutely prodigious traditional ecological knowledge and people trained in Western ecology, if you want to call it that, and bringing the strengths of both together to better manage hunting and just ecosystems in general. But yeah, no, those are great questions.
Yeah, I was wondering if you're doing any work with Joe Fragoso, has been working out in the Amazon and is now doing some work in Sarawak. And his work shows how when local communities are custodians of the wildlife, they can do very good management of wildlife resources and protect high density of the same species they hunt upon. So it's a very important area of work to see how to get this kind of win-win situations. So we have another question. Let's move to another speaker. And people making a question. So then we have a question from Kelvin Chen from Rutgers University. Say, any idea how defaunation is affecting abundances of mammals such as bats and rodents, which pose a special risk towards humans as reservoirs of zoonotic disease, of hunting and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any data myself on bats. I know that hunting has destroyed bat populations in a lot of parts of Asia. I just, anecdotally, when we go to really heavily Muslim areas, we see so many more big fruit bats than when we go to areas that are more Christian or animist, where those big fruit bats are eaten. So I know there's a huge impact on bats of hunting, but that's just from either anecdotal observations and the literature. The zoonotic link is clearly super important, and we've everybody's been really interested in that since COVID, of course. I've contributed data to different teams who are trying to model that kind of thing. I'm sure Ahimsa has as well, but I don't know the exact specifics of how defaunation relates to zoonotic transmission risk very well.
Yeah, I know there is some work that is, it's currently under review that probably will be published very soon, that is looking at this at a regional, actually pantropical scale. But there's always the issue of how to quantify defaunation and particularly hunting. They were trying to link with hunting, and so there are a number of issues there that are being kind of explored. So we have another question from E. And thank you very much for your amazing talk. We had many good comments yet. And could you expand a bit more on the mechanism that makes short length and large patch connecting corridors more important? And if we put this in a meta-population context, if these important corridors only connect few patch clusters in a small region, how can we preserve the genetic diversity across the whole meta-population? And how can we ensure the long-distance dispersal requirement for some species is met?
Those are great questions. Super good questions. I'll try to remember all of them. So starting with the first one, yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I didn't have time to explain it during the talk. But I think there are two main reasons why short links connecting big patches are the most important. One is that a lot of mammals just don't disperse very far at all, ever. So even a medium length corridor is going to be too long for them to traverse. And the second reason is that if you've got two big patches and you link them, you effectively make one big super patch. And if you have, and then we know from, ecology, comparing like a classic, what they call a Levens type metapopulation to like an island biogeography, an island mainland type metapopulation, the extinction rates are totally different in those two systems. So if you've got a single giant super patch, it's not going to go extinct. The extinction chance, the chance of something going extinct in that patch is very, very small. And if even one patch in the whole metapopulation is not going to go extinct, then the whole metapopulation won't go extinct. Now, we were only looking at kind of metapopulation dynamics. Maybe you could argue those are based on demographics, or at least a proxy for demographics. We were not looking at genetics at all. So you're absolutely right that over long term, there does need to be dispersal. Long distance dispersal. I guess, again, I would say that, if there is a super patch, it should be holding high enough abundance that to avoid, deleterious inbreeding and whatnot. But yeah, there could be, for the reason you bring up, there could be justification to also have some longer distance patches too. And I think the other justification for that too is that, in this simple example I presented, we're assuming the forest is more or less homogeneous, but there may also be a little isolated patch of some ecosystem that's just very different from the others that you really want to protect, and you really want to keep it linked into the whole network.
Yes. How much do you integrate animal behavior in the connectivity?
Yeah, so I don't at all. I haven't done that at all. I have a good colleague, Rob Fletcher, University of Florida. You might know him. He's been doing a lot of work with really sophisticated connectivity modeling, including some aspects of behavior and also mortality. Like, it's not just where the animals go across the landscape, it's also the fact that they can die every step of the way, and their chances of dying will vary based on a bunch of things. Anyway, you absolutely can incorporate behavior, but I haven't done it.
Yeah. We have one question from Myanmar. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. I want to know your suggestions and comments. So then this is three questions on how to identify priority conservation areas in terrestrial ecosystems. Sometimes we cannot take into account all the vertebrate species. In this case, can we identify priority conservation areas for threatened vertebrates only based on what criteria we should identify? So yeah, how to prioritize with limited information, particularly, I guess, for flagship or, very, very conspicuous species?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you just, when we were doing our analysis, people would, there are always questions or critiques, and I would say, look, this is just the best available. This is the best we can do with available data. And I think that explanation is really all you can do. We have to make some effort to prioritize our conservation efforts, be they new protected areas or corridors or anti-unsustainable hunting patrols. But we're never going to be able to do that perfectly. So we just have to use the best available information. And if all you have are threatened vertebrates, then yeah, absolutely go with that. I would always try to get at least some plant data in there if you can too, or some proxy for that, like forest types. So the Sabah Forest Department in Malaysia had a map of different types of forests, like so it's not just a homogeneous tropical rainforest, right? They had different ecosystem types based on species composition of the trees, which we threw into our model as well. So yeah, whatever and then I guess the last thing I'll say there too is it also really depends on the policymakers. We as ecologists, we can say, here's what we recommend. But at the end of the day, if the policymakers say, no, really all we care about are elephants and orangutans, then that's what you have to go with.
Yeah, talking about plants, I want to give you credit for your 2009 paper in Science that I think open many perspectives about the impact of deforestation on plant communities and things like carbon stocks. That has led to a lot of work by many people after that. So that was a very, very visionary paper and very, very influential paper. We have a question from Laos that is very similar to the previous question from Duan Fachan, and he's asking, thank you for the fascinating talk. Many Southeast Asian countries now face habitat loss and fragmentation due to different factors. What are the main problems and possible solutions for multi-habitat connectivity conservation initiatives? I'm not very sure what is multi-habitat connectivity, but I guess it's having not only tropical rainforest, but having all the kind of ecosystems, or maybe different patches. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Advice for Laos.
Yeah, I think that is really important, particularly as we think about climate resilience too. And I kind of hinted at that with the elevational connectivity, where we want to not just have corridors linking existing protected areas, we also want to have them spanning, from the lowlands up to higher elevations, so that as the ravages of climate change continue to increase, species can shift where they live to get the conditions and resources they need. And I think that applies too, for maybe more directly to your question, for linking different habitat types too. So, and partly because those habitat types are going to change. I mean, what is now, what is now coastal forest might become underwater. And what is now, a mid-elevation forest could see an influx of a huge number of lowland species. So I think maintaining connectivity amongst different habitat types does become super important. And I think if you have the data, there's no reason that you can't do that. The same kind of optimization that I talked about for a more complicated scenario with different habitat types.
And this will be the final question from the floor. This is from Tan Hui from Peking University, and he's asking, thank you for your excellent speech. If you would like to assess the effectiveness of protected areas in China, how would you do it? Do you have any suggestions on how to do that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think so. When we did our study, it was very, it was retrospective. We were compiling data that weren't specifically collected necessarily for protected area efficacy. So it can be much more effective to just go out and do a targeted study on protected area efficacy if that's what you want to find out. So I think, comparing any number of biodiversity surveys combined with LiDAR or other remote sensing data on the forest quality and forest structure, and then looking both with comparing inside protected areas to outside, but then also looking for spillover versus leakage effects, and then there's some really cool, sophisticated statistical techniques you can do to make sure that you have balanced covariate sets of covariates, and then also, of course, to deconfound any statistical analyses, so that you can actually get a more or less causal relationship between the establishment of protected areas and biodiversity outcomes, even without necessarily having before-after data. So yeah, it's a good question, but I think you could definitely do it. It would just, those biodiversity surveys are hard, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience do a lot of these things, and they're hard, they're expensive, they're hard to standardize, but those data are so important.
Yep. So I will just close with a final question about climate change. So then you mentioned climate change at the very beginning, but you say, well, something that we can discuss more later. And actually you had a very interesting paper with James Watson earlier this year in PNAS about how climate change will affect biodiversity. And I think your point is very important. I think you are talking about indirect effects, right? How probably the largest scale impacts will not be due to the kind of biophysical conditions itself, but it's about how humans will respond to climate change. So would you like to mention something about the key point in that paper?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so I did. I mentioned that climate change, at least in that one paper that we did, had very minimal effect, but that's because we treated climate change as just its own thing. You know, there's habitat loss, there's hunting, there's pollution, there's disease, there's inbreeding, there's climate change. But climate change isn't its own thing. It interacts with all the other anthropogenic stressors. Climate change makes pollution worse. It enhances disease spread. It exacerbates habitat loss. It can even potentially exacerbate hunting pressure. So the point we were making in that paper is just that climate change is, you know, it's not effective to view it as just rising temperature and altered precipitation. It's all these other things as well. And those are just, I mean, even just the temperature and precipitation alone are getting so severe right now. But I think those interactions with the other human stressors are just blowing up. Yeah, I'm glad you guys had James Watson give a talk recently too. Mm-hmm. He's great. And I was just on a call with him, and he said, in regards to climate change, we're going down a cliff on skis with a blindfold on. That's where we are with climate change right now. We have no idea what's happening or what's going to happen, and it's scary.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it has been a really, despite the last words on realistic kind of scary statements, has been really exciting, very informative, and I think you can see the feedback was very positive. So then I will encourage you to submit some paper to Integrative Conservation, and I will just remind the audience that on Tuesday, 5th of December, we are planning a panel with about wildlife conservation in China, and also some perspective from outside China. And in January, we will have a Professor E.J. Milner-Gulden from Oxford, who also will be talking about the conservation, social aspect of conservation. So thank you very much, Jeff, and let's be in touch. Well, I will follow up. And thank you everyone for joining.